Good morning and good evening. Welcome to the first session of GIGF 2020. I'm So-Young Kim, Director of the Korea Policy Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution at KAIST. I'll be moderating the first session. In this session titled "The Transition to Non-Context Society and Digital Innovation," we'll be exploring the innovative potentials of advanced technologies, especially digital technologies, for inclusive and human-centered growth in the increasingly non-context society. Ever since the creation of the first modern digital computer, ENIAC in 1945, we have seen in the last 5 decades remarkable progress of digital technologies and infrastructure that undergird our economy and also practically define our everyday life. In particular, latest development of AI technologies, especially machine learning or deep learning due to marvelous computing power, has enabled seamless integration of physical and digital spaces, changing many areas of human experience. This year in particular seems to be a very special year just because it seems to be becoming a watershed for the trajectory of digital technologies. Because COVID-19, once a century crisis, is really supercharging the potentials of digital technologies in making our everyday life just sustainable by allowing many everyday functions just going on. So for the first session, I'd like to introduce each speaker just when they present their when they make their presentations. Today we have an incredible assortment of presentations running from the core computing technology underlying digital innovation by Mr. Strier from Nvidia, and one of the best applications of big data analytics for tracking epidemics by Dr. Khan from BlueDot, and also the impacts of automation on work and skills by Professor Brynjolfsson of Stanford University, and finally the implication of increasingly advanced digital technologies for global digital divide. So let me just introduce the first speaker. So first speaker, Mr. Keith Strier, is Vice President and leader of a worldwide AI initiative at Nvidia. Mr. Strier was recently appointed by OECD as a co-chair AI Compute Task Force, and also he is a special advisor to the UN Center of AI and Robotics at The Hague. For the viewers, I'd like to recommend you just check the profile, more detailed profile of each speaker on our website, because their profile is really long. So we wouldn't just spend much time on introducing everybody in detail. So please check the website. Okay, Mr. Strier, are you ready?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Okay, yes, go ahead.
Okay, terrific. Well, first, I'd like to thank the Ministry of Economy and Finance and the World Bank for this wonderful event, and very honored to be on this panel with my esteemed colleagues. Let me share my screen and jump right into it. Okay. So we only have 10 minutes or so. I have the privilege of being a vice president at Nvidia, which is one of the fastest growing, most innovative companies in the world with just a very interesting history. And I think in trying to share some ideas, some input, and some wisdom in this particular forum, even though we only have a short period of time, I'd like to start with really talking a little bit about the history of the company, because it really sets the stage for this conversation. About 30 years ago, a band of brilliant engineers got together and conceived of this new kind of processor called the graphics processing unit. Right there, you can see a picture of the first consumer GPU about 20 years ago, basically. And Jensen Huang, the CEO and co-founder, and his colleagues, they didn't just invent a chip. They unleashed, our imagination and really launched the modern era of graphics and the modern era of gaming. Right, and now today, millions and millions, tens of millions of gamers get lost in these synthetic worlds like Fortnite and Minecraft, thanks to this technology and all the artistry that it powers on top of that. Now, of course, the company is not just a gaming company, and this is not just about chips. In fact, over the past 30 years, what's so incredible is just how this company has pursued this vision of this full stack innovation model of really focusing not just on the engineering, which is at the core of the company, but creating, going from a chip to an accelerated computing platform company, and sort of these four basic layers of innovation that happen continuously in the company. And it's almost dizzying to work in Nvidia because of that. You have the hardware layer, of course, and the incredible engineers that work on the physical hardware itself, the chips, the systems, the network technology, all the things that either go in and inside the box. But that's just the part of it. What's interesting about Nvidia is we actually have more software engineers than we do hardware engineers. So just incredible libraries and operating system software across the whole spectrum. And there's one common actually operating system called CUDA that stretches from the largest hyperscale data centers all the way down to a $100 drone. But the hardware plus the software, and of course that's all multiplied by the innovation in the open, in the community, in the data science community, the computer science community, all of these open source frameworks that are accelerated on top of our platform and then applied towards almost a limitless number of use cases. And then above that, you have these incredible ecosystems of partners and applications, sort of beginning at the fields of science, but then stretching outwards to the creative industries and ultimately across the public and private sectors. So it is these four levels of innovation that are continuously churning, sort of inside of NVIDIA and accelerating this sort of convergence, right, of digital and physical innovation. And now today, as you're walking down the campus in a university, you might see, one of these robots sort of whiz by you, bringing someone their pizza or their sandwich for lunch, right? And it's not going to slam into you because it has an awareness of the environment, and it's not just following a course; it's navigating the physical world using the intelligence that's been trained in a larger system and then embedded into its onboard brain, and that's that's part of our world now. And then increasingly, that level of intelligence and autonomy is going to find its way to the roads, right? And starting in 2024, this next generation of Mercedes will not just be cars; they will be software-defined vehicles that will have supercomputers in them that are so powerful that they are actually far more compute that's needed on day one, that they have been scoped specifically to anticipate years of innovation that will follow, features that we don't even know exist today. And the hope is that this new generation of technology won't just be safer and a better experience, but it will actually go up in value over time based on the combination of human and technology innovation. And then, of course, back in the data center, you have these incredible AI supercomputers that have evolved over the last 20 years, really, when you think of the modern era of high performance computing, but really just the last 8 years since the sort of convergence of our GPUs and deep learning really exploded in 2012. This is a picture of Selene. Selene is our newest supercomputer. It's actually, we have multiple of the world leadership class computers. We have multiple ones at our headquarters in Santa Clara. This one was just built and operationalized this year, and actually in less than 30 days. And Selene is the fastest industrial AI supercomputer in the United States, the second most efficient and sustainable computer in the world, and the sixth fastest in the world as well. And it measures at what we would call a 1 exaflop, and it's not worth going into the technical details, but the speed of this one machine is equal to the next fastest 160 computers combined, just to give you a sense of that scale. Now, so you have these machines, and you have hundreds of these around the world of different sizes, and the question is, how did we get there? I mean, how is it that we have these incredible tools? And the standard metric for the sort of the trajectory of progress in the computing industry has been this Moore's law concept, which has been around for several decades, really, and it's been widely practiced and proven and documented that roughly every 2 years, the density of the transistors in a chip has doubled and so forth, and that has been a very important trend for the industry. But that trend is leveling out, and what Christopher Mims from the Wall Street Journal recently noted is that the new trajectory of innovation, the arc of compute power, no longer maps to that rule, because really Moore's law was really anchored to progress in manufacturing, to efficiencies in the ability to produce these chips. The new law, which has been coined as Wang's law after our CEO, is really about the integration of both the hardware and the software. And when you combine those two, the trajectory of innovation more than doubles every 2 years. And now you're looking at hundreds of times of performance, not doubling, but again more than doubling. So just in a period of 5 or 6 years, the performance of our systems have improved more than 300 times. And so, and that's barely keeping up with the scale of the data sets and the data models that they're powering. So this is just the trajectory. Now, when you have this kind of power, what can you do? How can you apply that? Because you can apply that in many, many different ways. And one of the more interesting ones, frankly, just, for what it's worth, given the incredible health crisis we've been all experiencing around the world, in the pursuit of a COVID, of a cure, of a vaccine, of treatments. One of the labs, Oak Ridge, which is working on a system called Summit, which is very similar to our Selene system in terms of its scale and its power, and powered by Nvidia, has been able to take the time that it would normally take to look at a billion compounds, so the targets for identifying a vaccine. To look at a billion compounds, that would normally take 12 months of research and effort, and that would be considered quite an accomplishment. Applying this high performance computing and artificial intelligence and all of these different modern tools, that time period has been reduced from 12 months to 12 hours, right? So 25,000 targets are evaluated, not every hour or every minute, but every second. And so just try to grasp that speed. So that's the power of speed and innovation in a very real life way that's making a difference in our world. Now, to sort of bring full circle, because the name of this presentation was Accelerating the Physical and Digital Innovation. One of the really, really cool things that's coming into play is this new platform we've developed called Nvidia Omniverse. And this is the first truly interoperable collaboration platform that creates high performance simulations of complex 3D environments. And that's a lot of words, but what that really lets you do is it lets you simulate reality so that you can create new reality. So let me just give an example. When you come to design a building, and that's actually a picture of our headquarters, by the way. That's an actual picture of the headquarters that is under construction right now in Santa Clara. Now, visualizing and designing buildings inside of computers is not a new idea, but we didn't just design it. You could actually feel it. We simulated every ray of light, every light beam, every sound wave. We could determine what it would feel. How comfortable would it be to sit behind this desk in this office? What would it be like to have a crowd at this part of the lobby? How would that affect the ability for other folks to actually focus on their work? So this is not just about designing and visualizing. This is about feeling and experiencing technology and innovation in a simulated world, so that you can create it, frankly, more perfectly in the physical world, like designing a car, but not just the way the car looks. How about how it feels, how it drives? How does it feel to sit in the car and hold the steering wheel? And probably one of the more interesting applications will be robotics. And this is where I'll just kind of go back to the car example, because really what machines, as you go from artificial intelligence to autonomous machines, you need to train these machines. And this is quite an extensive process. And it's much more efficient and frankly safer to train these machines in a simulated world than in a physical one. So much like the Matrix movie, the future of this kind of technology innovation will be not only to design, but to train these self-driving cars, these industrial robotics, these human care robots, whatever it is. They'll actually learn inside of a hyper-realistic 3D world like the one that we're showing here, powered by a supercomputer, because you need that kind of compute to make this work. And then once that's learned, a machine learns what its job is and how to do it safely, it'll be downloaded into the physical machine and off it goes, again, whether it's hitting the road or hitting the factory floor. So this will be the new sort of brave world of digital physical convergence, powered by not just computers, but artificial intelligence and, of course, human ingenuity all together. So I think I'm out of time. That's my 10 minutes. So I'll just wrap it up on that point. Thank you again for letting us participate. And I will give the screen back to the moderator.
Thank you very much, Mr. Strier. It's really wonderful or amazing. It's really hard to imagine the ultimate limit of computing power. And one thing that is for sure is that Nvidia has become really a household name these days, like Google or Apple, because just only a few years ago, it was relatively a kind of a cult company, more or less known to gamers and developers of gaming. But anyway, thank you very much for the presentation. The next presentation is by Professor Erik Brynjolfsson, who is the director of Digital Economy Lab at Stanford Institute of Human-Centered AI. And also he is a research associate at US NBER. Well, Professor Brynjolfsson is so famous, so I don't really need much introduction, but he has authored 9 books, and most of them are already bestsellers. And I guess the most famous one is The Second Machine Age, Work, Progress, and Prosperity in a Time of Brilliant Technologies. And he has many stories to tell today, so I'd like to ask you again to limit your presentation to 10 minutes, but we will have plenty of time for discussion. Okay, Professor Brynjolfsson, can you just start off?
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you for that very kind introduction. And it's a real honor to be here at the Global Innovation Growth Forum. The other speakers have been just fascinating. And I'm looking forward to sharing some of the research we've been doing here at the Stanford Digital Economy Lab. So let me share my slides here, and I hope you can see them now. I'm going to talk about the AI awakening and what it means for the economy. And what I mean by that is just some really awe-inspiring improvements in the technologies and how that's changing work and employment and productivity and what we need to do to do even a better job. So let me just remind you all, and you've been hearing a bit of it, Keith gave a great explanation of some of the remarkable breakthroughs and some of the fundamentals and the hardware and the software, the algorithms, the data. These things have combined to allow us to do things that previously only humans could do. For instance, here's data from ImageNet. And as you can see, machines used to not be very good, but then with the introduction of deep learning in 2012, they really took off and are now, in many cases, exceeding human performance. You see this not just in faces or animals that you might recognize in Facebook and elsewhere, but also in medical imaging and a number of other kinds of applications. There's still a long way to go, and there are places where humans still have a significant advantage, but it's been quite a transformation. And as an economist, when the machines start becoming equal to or better than humans, it's a threshold that's very important for economic decision-making in terms of which type of entity, human or machine, you assign to different kinds of tasks. And of course, it's not just vision. Basically, any supervised learning systems are now able to address almost any type of task where you have a well-defined set of data for the inputs, X, and well-defined outputs, Y. And you can see whether that's speech recognition, or trading, or pharmaceutical R&D. There's just some amazing work on protein folding by Google's DeepMind unit, the AlphaFold group, fraud detection. You could go on and on. I'm confident that everyone in this conference is in an organization that could have dozens of these kinds of opportunities now to take advantage of. Now, I could talk more about the technology, but what I really want to transition to is talking about what's going to happen to the workforce and wages. And the way most people think about this, and really I thought about it mostly at first, is that technology can be a substitute for humans and replace what humans are doing. And that's a natural way to think about it. But we dove in a little bit deeper and doing some work with Tom Mitchell. We identified actually 6 main categories that economists talk about that technology affects wages. In addition to substitution, for instance, it can complement or make human labor more valuable. It can affect demand and incomes and supplies, and it can even lead to new tasks and the transformation of work. These other 5 possibilities, in addition to substitution, are often more important. In fact, historically have been more important. And we know that because over the past 200 or 300 years, human wages have not gone down, they've gone up. So the value of human labor is increasing as machines increase the value of it, complement it, and lead to new invention in these different ways. Now, we have a very big project looking specifically at the places that machine learning is going to change work the most, which tasks. And the first premise understanding is that currently machine learning is very far from artificial general intelligence. I know that in some of the great science fiction books, you hear about machines that, like the Terminator, that can do essentially everything a human can do. But we're very far from that. We will be for decades. But what we do have, as I mentioned, is machines that are working at human level or superhuman level. And the interesting question then is which tasks are suitable for human level and which tasks are not suitable for human level. And the way we went about it is we looked at about 18,000 specific tasks and ranked every single one of them based on their suitability for machine learning using this rubric that we developed. One of the things that we found was that even if you pick the very best, the tasks that are very easiest for machines to automate, the top 90%, you get over $700 billion of tasks just in the US economy that are automatable, and 10 times that worldwide. You can also zoom in on individual occupations. These red dots represent over 900 occupations in the United States economy, and similar mapping into Korea or other countries. And on the horizontal axis, a scale from 0 to 100 is the relative wage of that job. For instance, on the left are relatively low paid jobs, and the right are high paid jobs. The vertical axis is the score we give it on how suitable that task is for machine learning. Higher on this graph are jobs that are more suitable, and they have a lot of tasks that are suitable for machine learning. And for instance, cashiers are relatively low paid, but much of their work can be automated with vision recognition and other tools. There's some high paid jobs like airline pilots that also are suitable for machine learning. But the overall slope is downward, implying that the low wage jobs tend to have more of their tasks suitable for machine learning. And of course, I couldn't help peeking and seeing where economists came out. We are paid pretty well, maybe not as well as some economists think they should be. And for now, a little below average in terms of the ability for machine learning to take over some of the tasks. We can also zoom in on any given individual company. So we've developed a tool where we can look at the different jobs in the company and see how they might be transformed. For instance, we work with a big bank, and we looked at hundreds of different occupations, including this one, a personal banker. And as you can see in the upper right, while personal bankers are very vulnerable, there's possibilities of personal bankers transforming their job and becoming what we call personal banker 2.0. And what this means is really learning more of the low machine learnable skills and eliminating some of the skills that are easiest for machines to do and transferring them over to machines. But we can also have them transfer to new roles like a business analyst, mortgage loan officer. And in the bottom right, we have a mapping of how similar the skills are in one role to the other role, which gives you a sense of how easy it is to make that transition. So our hope is that while machines will transform many, many occupations, they'll also give us a tool for mapping how to do things differently. Let me take a few minutes to talk about productivity, which is frankly a bit of a puzzle for many economists. I think there's no doubt that the underlying technologies are awe-inspiring and in some ways even, as Keith said, exceeding the progress in Moore's Law. Yet you may be surprised to know that we have not seen a productivity boom. In fact, the reality is that productivity growth has slowed everywhere. For over a decade now, the rate of growth of productivity, while still positive, is not as great as it was previously. Specifically in the US, it used to be about 2.8% per year, and now it's growing only about 1.3%, including last year it grew about 1.3%. And of course, 2020 will be a very unusual year once that note comes in. I double checked on Korea, and actually, disappointingly, the slowdown has been even greater in Korea. Korea grew faster in the early part of the period, and since in the past decade or so, Korean productivity growth has been even slower than it was in the United States. And, it's not unusual for this to happen. In fact, 29 of 30 countries saw comparable or larger slowdowns as we just saw. I just showed you in the United States. So that's a bit of a puzzle, isn't it? Because I don't think that the technology has stopped, yet we haven't turned it into productivity. Now, there are several different explanations. I wrote a paper with Chad Severson and Daniel Rock describing some of these explanations. And let me just go through each of them quickly. One is that, maybe we're overrating the technology. Frankly, I don't put too much weight on that, but some people do. Another important one is that we're mismeasuring the benefits. And there's a lot of evidence of this one. In particular, many of the benefits of these new technologies result in digital goods and services like GPS maps, or Zoom. It's appropriate that we're using this right now. Google search, Wikipedia. These benefits, I think, are very large, but they don't have much of an effect on GDP because GDP measures everything that has a positive price. So if something has a zero price, then it has a weight of 0 in GDP. In turn, productivity is GDP divided by hours worked. So if you're not measuring GDP correctly, you're also mismeasuring productivity. That's a big problem, and it's one that's getting worse as we get more and more digital goods and services. There are also concerns about the distribution, more of the benefits going to a smaller group, 1% or 1/10 of 1%, and the median person not participating. There's a lot of what economists call rent dissipation that results from that as the gains are not widely shared. And then finally, the one I really want to focus on actually is explanation number 4, that it's not enough to have an amazing technology. You also have to implement it. And that often means, almost always means, reskilling the workforce, restructuring organizations, changing your business models. And that takes time. What we found is that kind of reinventing of an economy, reinventing of a business, reinventing of an individual skills can take years or even decades. In short, technology is just the tip of the iceberg. Less than 10% of the investment is in the hard technology, hardware and software. The rest of the investment needed is in organizational process reinvention, skill investment, and other sorts of changes like that. And we've documented this in a series of papers going back over a decade now. The result is that if you want to take advantage of these technologies, you have to make investments in intangible assets. And those intangible assets don't show up in our GDP. They may create real assets, but they don't create real output right away until they're fully implemented. And we've shown that this leads to what we call a productivity J curve. As you can see with this stylized example, at first productivity falls, maybe for up to 10 or even 20 years. And then later, as the intangible assets are harvested, you see a surge in productivity. And in the paper, we document this for real examples of different economies. And you can see that there's a J-curve effect quite common in many of them. Let me just wrap up by saying that we have some good news in terms of, I think, productivity that's going to be coming. Well, the 2020s, I think, will be an era of a productivity boom. We have the potential for reskilling work and for better health. But while digital progress does make the economic pie bigger, there's no guarantee that everyone's going to benefit. There's nothing in any economic textbook or economic theory that says the benefits will be even. It's possible for most of the gains to go to a small group of people, even less than a majority. Most people may actually be made worse off, even as the overall pie gets bigger. That's not what happened for most of the past 2 centuries or so, in the 1700s, 1800s, and most of the 1900s. But over the past 10 or 20 years, I'm afraid that is what's been happening. We have seen that the gains have gone to a much smaller group than they did historically, as digital technologies allow people to concentrate wealth in a way that they couldn't have before. And our institutions, our laws, and our organizations have often reinforced that rather than leading to more widely shared prosperity. So I think the challenge going forward is that thanks to the hard work of a lot of people in tech organizations and computer scientists and others, digital technologies will continue to accelerate, but our organizations and institutions are lagging. They're not improving exponentially. They're certainly not doubling in power every 2 years the way some of our technologies are. Thank you, Nvidia. So if we want to prevent a mismatch, we need to work harder on digital transformation so that our skills and organizations keep up with these amazing technologies. And so our agenda at the Digital Economy Lab is to reinvent the economy, to understand how to reinvent organizations, and to begin that transformation so that we can have not just prosperity, but widely shared prosperity. Thanks very much. Why don't I'll stop there, and I look forward to your questions and comments later on.
Thank you very much, Professor Brynjolfsson. We have good news and bad news. So good news is that we don't have artificial intelligence in general form, so that we don't need to worry about our Terminator coming up soon. But still, another bad news is digital technologies of the latest years, in fact, are having very serious impact on wealth and other income gaps, which naturally leads to the third presentation, because this third presentation is about the digital divide, especially on the global scale. So let me just briefly introduce the third speaker, Dr. Nicole Turner Lee, who is a senior fellow in governance studies and also the director of the Center for Technology Innovation at the Brookings Institution. Her work focuses on digital governance, internet governance issues, including digital futures, AI and ethics, algorithmic bias, and in many issues at the intersection between technology and policy, and also civil human rights. So without further ado, just let's have her just start a presentation. Okay, Dr. Lee, can you go on?
Yes. Yes. Good evening, everybody. And I'm so happy to be here. I want to echo the kind introduction from our friends with regards to the work that I do. And I feel so out of place because normally I would talk about AI, but tonight I'm going to talk, or this morning I'm going to talk about digital divide. And let me tell you why that is important. I think it's important for us to understand that the pandemic in many ways has disrupted the type of normal wear and tear and daily care that all of us have in our societies. We have found ourselves in a state where the public health crisis of COVID-19 has forced us to social distance in ways to mitigate the spread of the virus. And it's no secret that across the world, there have been complications and consequences as a result of this public health crisis, some of which has actually accelerated the digitization in our societies in ways that have generated both fair and unfair results. And I think as we look at, and my previous colleagues have actually mentioned, the future of technology, particularly in artificial intelligence, these are actually promising times with regards to what machine learning algorithms as well as autonomous systems can do to accelerate vaccinations, to help in the provision of care, to also help in what I think Korea is trying to do, the acceleration of a contactless society. But at the same token, before the pandemic, in the world, we had very large rates of individuals that were disconnected. Less than 1 and fewer than 4 in many underdeveloped countries were actually connected online. And in the United States, according to the Federal Communications Commission, 18 million Americans were without broadband access. And those citizens resided in both rural and urban communities, but were predominantly on the scale of being economically compromised, so lower income. They tended to be English speakers and disproportionately people of color and older Americans. And within that group of people, we have seen this tension between what digital technology offers and how we live, we learn, we earn, in some cases we love, and how the lack of access to technology often leads to a state of digital invisibility. Let me put out there just a shameless plug that next year I'll be publishing a book on the US digital divide entitled Digitally Invisible: How the Internet is Creating the New Underclass. And as we have watched the pandemic actually accelerate its own self, its own form, it too has contributed to a series of systemic inequalities, disparities of who is online and who is not online, and that has consequences. Korea is no exception. As we look at the young people who have been able to return to work through remote learning, who have been able to take advantage of the disruption of technology in the delivery of healthcare, who are now learning and educating themselves via online protocols. That is not the case among Korea's older populations, nor is it the case in the United States, where people who are over the age of 80 do not have the likelihood of aging in place. And I share all this because as I've actually worked in this space over the last 20 years, and as I've looked at how technology has been a game changer in the future of industries, I'm concerned because the digital divide on the global scale is one that becomes results in social and geographic isolation, increased poverty and the lack of access to wealth, declines in entrepreneurship, and essentially the society of social isolation that many of us in this conversation have never predicted in our lives. So what does that mean in terms of moving forward? And I want to use my time diligently to share, I think, my version of a tech New Deal. At Brookings, I've been actively working on this issue, and it was really interesting when the invitation came, because my tech New Deal is a lot different from what we're seeing in Korea, though it is intentioned along the same premise of capturing what we are seeing as the economic outputs and benefits of the use of technology to maintain safety as we navigate through this public health crisis. First and foremost, in my tech New Deal, I want to take you back to an era in which I was not born, which is the Great Depression in the United States, where there was the need to come up with economic recovery solutions that would allow the United States to both come back in terms of economic self-sufficiency, but at the same time create new opportunities for displaced workers and others who had no place within society when it came to productivity. We are not too far away from that economic reality. Here in the United States, the pandemic started with about 40 million people filing for unemployment insurance, 100,000 small businesses permanently closed. And what we are continuing to see as we determine and weed out those who were flexible and agile in the new digital economy, that many of these businesses will become desolate. But they will be replaced, as we're hearing from other panelists. The question is the extent to which they will be replaced in an accelerated manner. So I will just leave you all with these thoughts before we get into the panel discussion on what is the new tech New Deal that I'm proposing. The new tech New Deal that I'm proposing is actually an overlay of intersectionality. It starts with the general premise of having infrastructure available at the physical level, meaning whatever that infrastructure may be, fiber, 5G wireless, wireline, that we actually engage in a conversation in the US and globally as to how we accelerate access to digital technologies from a physical perspective so that we do not leave people offline or on the wrong side of digital opportunity. Infrastructure today, as my colleagues have actually also mentioned, is not just about the types of connectivity, the bits, the bytes, or the fiber lines that run, but they also involve data infrastructure. And the extent to which we build upon both as the new currency of the internet ecosystem is actually our personal private data will actually determine the extent to which we start, I think, this road to economic recovery by taking advantage of these assets. Secondly, there has to be people in our countries who are going to build these infrastructures. And just like the New Deal of the earlier times, it's important that we train people on these new automated systems, in addition to giving them the skills necessary to build the new next generation roads and bridges. Here in the US, the development of 5G technologies, for example, is slated to develop jobs in the triple digit numbers and return back to the economy livable wage scale jobs, particularly for people who have been out of the workforce or chronically unemployed or displaced by the future of industries. I just was on a panel this morning at Brookings in terms of automation, and these realities will strike those who were the most vulnerable and those who have been least successful in getting out of the consequences or the negative consequences of this pandemic. And then I would say finally with the Tech New Deal, it's important that we also weigh in the options. And this is where I think Korea is lending itself in its expertise in this space as to what the future of industries look like. Whether they are industries that are contactless, whether they are industries that are based on the artificial intelligence technologies that were discussed, whether they are the future industries that have changed the supply chain or how things are made in this country and abroad, it's important that we recognize that those indirect and direct benefits of being in a digital society will actually return on investment into our societies in ways that we've not been able to account for. So what do I mean by all of this in the end? And I'm going to close my remarks here. We have this particular moment of time, this inflection point, to actually combine for the first time in human history, the more active production and diffusion of technology. Normally, technologies have been based on a passive consumption model. And as a result, the focus across the world, I believe, has been on the commercialization of these technologies and not the extent to which we make them more inclusive, more equitable, and we actually bring in more actors and players to the table to ensure that we're actually using these technologies in ways that advance not just human cognition and decision-making as it's been explained, but also contributing to the very essence of what makes economic recovery possible. In Washington, where I'm based, as we have an incoming administration that will be looking for ways to actually prioritize both the existential threats of the economy, healthcare, the pandemic, among other things, it's important that technology is not marginalized to the side, but rather that it is pieced together in a constructive way that actually lends itself to getting out of some of the disparities that have been created through this pandemic and creating a pathway towards economic opportunity in ways that we've not imagined. And so I'll leave it there, but I look forward to the panel discussion because I think where we are right now with the digital divide, it really is telling how quickly a period of 11 months would show how important it is to be connected, but at the same time reveal the fact that there are digital deserts that exist across our countries that have essentially excluded and made invisible populations of people who require the technology the most to stay connected to the everyday realities of human life. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Thank you also for the remarkable reflection on the digital divide, which actually has been around for many, many years. And it was initially thought as a side effect of the rapid diffusion of digital devices, but now it's becoming a source of huge disparities, essentially generating fundamental gaps in resources and skills and capacities of different groups of people and also countries. Okay, so we're going to have discussion after the last speaker. Although we are running a little bit late. So the last speaker, Dr. Kamran Khan, is the founder and CEO of BlueDot, which is now, I guess, one of the most famous startups in the world because it's the company predicted the spread of COVID-19 for the first time in 2019, late 2019, and it predicted the global spread of COVID-19 in also the world's first peer-reviewed publication. And Dr. Khan is also a professor at the University of Toronto and also practicing actual physician of infectious disease. And I'm really, really glad to introduce Dr. Khan to this panel. Okay, Dr. Khan, can you just start?
Sure. Thank you very much, Professor Kim, for the kind introduction. And just thank you for inviting me to be a part of this discussion. I know we're running a little behind on time, so I will start sharing my screen. I do have a bit of a presentation here, and I hope that you can now see my screen. Well, I'm going to just spend my roughly 10 minutes or so talking a little bit about this global imperative that we now face, which is the need to build resilience to epidemic threats. If we've learned anything from COVID-19, it's that epidemic threats and infectious disease threats can appear without notice and can spread incredibly fast. It's almost in some ways, for many of us, hard to imagine just how much in a short period of time the entire world has been impacted by a virus that you could fit thousands of them on the head of a pin. And of course, this is not just restricted to COVID-19. If we do look past in the past decade, there have been 6 global public health emergencies declared by the World Health Organization. COVID-19 obviously being one of them, but it wasn't that long ago that we were facing the Zika epidemic in Latin America that spread to other parts of the world. It wasn't long before that we had the West African Ebola outbreak that then also spread to other parts of the globe. We actually had another pandemic only 10 years ago, the H1N1 influenza pandemic. And so this is a bit of an indication that we are experiencing outbreaks with greater frequency, with greater scale, and they're becoming more disruptive than they have ever before. What this ultimately means really for us is that if we are going to stay a step ahead of these types of threats, it means that we're going to have to move faster and smarter. We have really learned with this pandemic that time is critical. The sooner that you intervene, the more you can change the trajectory and course of an outbreak. So I'm really pleased to be sharing a little bit about the work that we've been doing at BlueDot. And really, this actually goes back 18 years for me, even long before BlueDot actually came into being. As Professor Kim mentioned, I'm a practicing infectious disease physician. I started my career here in Toronto in 2003. And some of you may remember that in 2003, the first novel coronavirus that we'd ever encountered before, SARS-CoV, emerged and spread around the world and showed up here in my hometown of Toronto. Infected colleagues, led to the deaths of people in the population, and really crippled our city for 4 months. So you can imagine this is a bit of deja vu for me here. Now we're with SARS-CoV-2, and it does feel a bit like we are in a cycle repeating these types of threats. So we've been building an epidemic intelligence system going back all the way back to 2003, and then BlueDot was founded 10 years later in 2013. I'm going to briefly talk about 3 pillars of our work. The first is really on early detection of infectious disease threats. Obviously, you can't respond to a threat if you're unaware of it. And the second pillar is really to try and understand, well, what does that threat mean? What is its potential for dispersion and spread? And if it does spread, what kind of impact might it have? Will it trigger another outbreak, or will it just remain, an illness in one traveler? And then finally, we have all the raw materials we need to be able to disseminate or spread knowledge around the world faster than an outbreak can spread. And this is ultimately what we're going to need to do in a very interconnected and interdependent world to be able to stay in front of these types of threats. So let me just briefly talk about each of these 3 pillars in a fairly high level here this morning. First of all, I want to talk about surveillance and detection of infectious disease threats. Now, what we've been working on is using our data scientists and our data engineers have been working to gather and extract and organize infectious disease data that's reported on what are called notifiable diseases, measles and mumps and other types of diseases around the globe, and organize and structure this data. But we've also learned that in many instances, there may be outbreaks occurring that are not being reported officially from the public health agencies, either because they're unaware, or maybe perhaps there are disincentives to sharing this information early on. And so ultimately, there are opportunities for us to be using some of these unofficial sources of information to gather timely knowledge of potential outbreaks. So our data scientists have worked with our veterinarians, our physicians, and other health experts to basically build out a series of algorithms that are looking for early signals of outbreaks of everything from plague to Lassa fever to even syndromes of respiratory illnesses like we saw with COVID-19. We're doing this in 65 different languages every 15 minutes around the clock, and scanning for news of outbreaks involving over 150 different diseases and pathogens. Using machine learning and natural language processing, we're able to eliminate information that's of low relevance. Maybe it's something about the heavy metal band anthrax not being about an actual outbreak, or eliminate duplicates of the same story that may be reported in different venues. So we're using these types of tools to take vast amounts of unstructured data and organize it and structure it in a way that really exceeds what a human team would be capable of doing. This would not be something, you would need a very, very large team of individuals to be able to do this work. And so this really augments human intelligence to have that global panoramic view of infectious disease activity. Now, knowing that there's an outbreak there is not enough. We know that these types of pathogens can jump across continents and international borders in hours or days. What we've been building is our GIS and geography experts have been building out spatial models. That blue pin there is the location of the market in Wuhan where the original cases of COVID-19 were reported. Using data from hundreds of millions of anonymized locations of mobile phones, as well as other types of GIS models that take into account road networks and physical boundaries, mountain ranges, bodies of water, et cetera, to identify how travelers might move from that location to neighboring airports and what's the probability that they would go to a particular airport. Now, we use these data to then automatically connect into the world's commercial air travel data, looking at almost all of the flight schedules across the planet. You can see this image here are the arcs from the moment when we first picked up news of an unusual cluster of pneumonia cases at the end of December in 2019 to be able to identify, and this was generated within about a second, where are those arcs? Where are the final destinations of passengers? These are all anonymized data, but traveling through commercial flights, including all their connections and so forth. So if we just look over into North America as an example, you can see some arcs into places like San Francisco, where the first known death was in Santa Clara County, over into New York City. And then you can see obviously a lot of travelers going to destinations in East Asia. And as Professor Kim mentioned, we were quite concerned about this, and in late December, in part because it had many echoes of the SARS coronavirus outbreak, with the emergence in an animal market and being an unusual respiratory illness. We published this study even before it was recognized that this was a coronavirus, and identified some of the leading cities that we would be concerned about this virus showing up in, particularly if we were just seeing the tip of the iceberg. Maybe the outbreak was actually much larger than the official case counts would identify. And these red dots here are beside cities that were hit by COVID-19 and impacted quite early in the course of the outbreak. Bangkok at the top of our list was also the very first city in the world outside of mainland China that had a case of COVID-19. Tokyo was 3 days later, and you can see that's just up at the top of this list here as well. Now, this is something we submitted back on January 8th. We did this because we wanted to share some of these results with the rest of the world and have it peer-reviewed and open access for anyone to access these types of data. Now, it's not enough to track outbreaks or to understand just how airplanes are moving around the world. Every single microbe behaves differently. Zika virus is very different than COVID-19, which is different than Lassa fever or measles. And in order to understand what kind of disruption may occur from a microbe, you really need to understand a variety of other factors, demographic factors. You may need to know something about animal populations, because many of these microbes actually have come to humans through animal populations, wild animals or livestock. You may need to know about mosquitoes and other insects that can transmit disease, climate conditions, health systems capacity. And so it's the integration of many of these diverse data sets that allow us to then look at these individual microbes to try and get a sense of what sort of impact they may have. I'm just going to give you one example. This is well before COVID-19. Of this study we published in The Lancet in early 2016. This was before Zika had been declared a public health emergency. And so what we used here was looking at the climate conditions, the biology of a mosquito, and having to understand those conditions, how travelers were moving out of areas in Latin America, and recognizing that Zika virus was spread by humans carrying the virus and infecting mosquitoes in the destinations that they went to. What we identified here was that Florida was receiving large volumes of travelers from areas where the virus was likely circulating, had the mosquito present, had the suitable climate conditions. And so this was actually identifying the outbreak that occurred in Florida 6 months before it occurred. So these are some ways that we can integrate diverse types of data to anticipate how outbreaks will spread. Now, the last piece I will just say before concluding here is that one of the real challenges that we face is being able to disseminate knowledge quickly. And the scientific literature is a very important way of disseminating knowledge. But as a professor, I can say it's not always the fastest way, especially when you're dealing with a crisis. Typically, when an outbreak occurs, it's the public health community that first hears about it. And then again, as a practicing physician, I can say it's often the healthcare community that hears about this next. And that's problematic because sick patients don't go to the public health department, they show up in the emergency department. And we hope that our frontline healthcare workers will actually be able to recognize a disease that maybe they've never seen or heard of before. But of course, that's not always the case, and that is a key vulnerability. The information then typically trickles down to the private sector, to the public. But this sort of waterfall approach is not really the ideal way to be disseminating knowledge. When we say we're all in this together, we ultimately really need a system that can empower different audiences, government and branches of government, the private sector. So we work, for example, with public health agencies, with departments of defense and security and agriculture, but with airlines and airports and other private sector organizations that are looking to anticipate disruptions in business continuity, protect their employees and customers, but also hospitals for the reasons that I mentioned before, to empower the triage nurse, to empower the doc in the emergency department, to be thinking about a microbe right at the moment that they need to be aware of it and thinking about it, not just for their own benefit, for their own safety and for the patient's safety, but remember that an astute clinician could literally stop an outbreak in its tracks, and a clinician that's unaware and distracted, like many of us are, because of the volumes of patients that we're seeing, could also be the part of the catalyst for an outbreak that occurs that could cripple an entire city. So I'm going to wrap up here and just say, leaving you with this quote from Frank Zappa about information not being knowledge. And I think the key point I'd like to make here is that going from data to insights is really just part of the way. And ultimately getting from insight into action really requires partnerships. It requires engagements with a wide array of different organizations in the public sector, in the private sector, in the healthcare sector. And so these types of insights can be integrated into workflows so that when the crisis hits, everyone is ready to be able to respond appropriately. And this is ultimately how I think we build the kind of resilience we need, given that this problem of COVID-19, that this will pass too, but there are unfortunately more of these that will lie ahead in our future that we need to be prepared for. So I'd like to just end here and thank you again for inviting me to be a part of this discussion today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khan. It's a fascinating story of detection of infectious diseases. I guess the story of BlueDot in detecting all these infectious diseases before the start of epidemic crisis will be remembered as really perpetually fascinating. We have, believe it or not, only 10 minutes left for the discussion. So instead of a free discussion, I guess probably we'll be just asking some specific questions for each panelist. But before doing this round of a discussion, let me introduce our discussant, Dr. Christopher Chang, who is a managing director of Kakao Mobility, which is the leading mobility platform company in this country. Of course, he has a long profile of experience. Again, I recommend viewers just to check our website. He worked at all these famous companies, the Hyundai Motor Company, Samsung Electronics, Qualcomm, and NASA JPL as an expert on mobility and energy and other issues. Okay, just the floor is over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Kim. Let me first ask to Mr. Strier. Thank you very much for your insightful presentation. So everyone knows Nvidia has pioneered breakthrough innovations in the computing industry since its invention of GeForce 256 back in 1999. As you mentioned, with the silicon chips and software powering AI, more than doubling in performance every other year, how do you envision the future of AI-driven innovations? And also, what would be the hurdles for realizing it? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, but they had forced my mute. They just unmuted me. Sorry. So yeah, of course. I mean, the trajectory of innovation is incredible, and it will continue. I am very optimistic of to how the technology will be applied and the role that the industry will play. I was really listening intently in some of the earlier presentations about the inequity that's occurring on our digital frontiers, and there is a version of that that's playing out specifically in the compute world, which is referred to as the compute divide, which is the great consolidation of the biggest computers in the wealthiest universities and countries. And I think that what we need to do to advance AI and to make sure that it reaches its full potential for society, and not just one layer of society, but all layers of society and all countries, not just the wealthiest countries, but even the smallest countries in Southeast Asia and in Africa and Latin America, that it's very important that that this technology becomes very consumable, very accessible, and that includes our role is to democratize the infrastructure that makes AI accessible. You can do that by putting it in many different places, like in the cloud, and you can also do it by driving the cost down and making it possible, what used to cost 100 million, then cost 10 million, then cost $1 million, then it cost 100,000, and then at some point it'll cost 10,000. So but this combination of innovation will help the industry achieve its goals and do it in a very responsible way.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it is related to the Dr. Lee's the presentation in somehow. So I cannot emphasize more the importance of the inclusivity, the equal opportunity. So this time, let me ask to Dr. Lee. So based on your discussion, what is so unique about the impact of COVID-19 on the global digital divide? So is it the matter of scale or the qualitatively different impact? So can you share your insight? What is the uniqueness from the COVID-19, please?
Yeah, no, and I'll be brief. I think that is such a great question to ask. I mean, I think we've always known that a digital divide has existed, and it's primarily been binary. It's been about who's been online and who is not online, who has a device, who doesn't have a device. COVID-19 has essentially accelerated the rate of digitization in ways that have created new forms of economic devastation. And because that availability of technology has become the floor for what we are seeing with many industries, it has made this tension between who's online and who's not online much more glaring and much more disparate in terms of the consequences. And so globally, I think because we've all had to do some physical social distancing, it's somewhat determined who has survived, who will survive this and who will not. And I think that's where these income disparities, the disparities that exist among marginalized populations around age, around language, around geographic location, become much more exacerbated. I'll give a great example and then I'll end here. COVID-19 and the digital divide that has actually been amplified as a result of it is actually telling us something about the disparities that exist in education. Here in the United States, for example, 50 million school-age kids were sent home in early March. 15 to 16 million of them did not have digital access, either home broadband or a device. 9 million did not have either. Today, we have young people who have been lost on the registration rolls simply because superintendents and principals cannot find them due to their inability to log on. And to me, that is the devastating impact of what this virus has done to not necessarily bring out the digital divide or at least say that there's a new digital divide, but to amplify the consequences of being disconnected in this new information economy. And to me, that is the part that keeps me up at night, because globally, we have not been able to solve this simply because we have not come up with a cooperative and collaborative model to make broadband accessible across the world.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Lee. Next, I want to ask to Professor Brynjolfsson. Personally, I like the quote by Pablo Picasso that the computers are useless. They can only give you answers. But recently, when we see the example of AlphaGo and other the famous examples, they no longer provide just an answer. This message that we need to race with machine is kind of the critical. Yet many of us fear AI winning over humans. So can you please tell us how can we race with rather than fearing to race against the machines?
Well, that's a great question, and it builds very much on what we just heard from Dr. Lee. I just want to briefly mention, we just finished a report on how COVID and remote work were changing the U.S. workforce, and what we found was very much what she was saying. There's been a growing gap. It was already growing, as you saw in my work on machine learning, but over the past year, information workers, professional workers, managerial workers have found a much easier time to work remotely like we are right now. But service workers and manufacturing workers were much more likely to become laid off rather than to continue to work remotely. And as you know, those groups tend to have lower wages on average. And so it tended to amplify some of the divisions that we'd already seen in society. And I suspect we'd see similar patterns if we looked at other nations. So your question is spot on. What we need to do is think about how we can use these technologies not to amplify these divides and substitute for work, but to improve the ability to work together. And you mentioned AlphaGo. Let me mention another recent breakthrough, AlphaFold, also by DeepMind. And this was a tool for helping identify protein folding. And if you talk to the people working with it, it's clear that it's mostly going to amplify human intelligence. It's going to make it easier for scientists and biologists to find new vaccines, new proteins, new solutions to a lot of our problems. The AlphaFold is a great tool for amplifying certain types of search, but it works very, very differently than humans. So it doesn't replace what humans are doing. And I would go back to Pablo Picasso's quote that for a long time, probably for my lifetime and maybe beyond, humans will still be the ones who are important to direct where the technology goes, ask the right questions, and use tools like AlphaFold. And I would implore my technology friends to continue to focus on tools that don't simply replace or mimic what humans are doing. There's too much efforts to sort of beat the Turing test, which is matching what humans currently do, and instead focus on doing something very different from what humans do, like AlphaFold, and therefore create a new set of tools that amplify what we can do. If we follow that second path, not only do I think we'll make better technological breakthroughs and scientific breakthroughs, I also think we'll have more broadly shared prosperity because, as you said, we will race with the machines helping us rather than against us.
Okay, thank you very much. I like your quote last. Lastly, let me ask to Dr. Khan. So I'm very impressed the BlueDot's story of the COVID-19 detection and the previous examples. And the BlueDot has built the track record of identifying and tracking the outbreaks of other infectious diseases long before COVID-19, such as Zika and SARS, etc. Given the virulence of COVID-19, can you please share how can you compare your work on COVID-19 with the experience in other infectious diseases? Any new technologies or techniques or insight introduce the design of AI analytics for COVID-19, please?
Well, thank you, first of all, for the question. And I think mindful that we're tight on time, so I'll keep my remarks fairly brief. I think what I'll say is that there are certain aspects to epidemics and pandemics where there may be certain common elements, but in many instances, they're actually quite different from one another. As you can imagine, COVID-19 and Zika and SARS, et cetera, can be quite different. There are some common elements that I think we have learned over time and started to build up a platform on, which is detection of pathogens and being able to really pick up early signals that there may be an outbreak occurring in a certain part of the world, perhaps before it is more widely recognized. When humans are transporting microbes to different parts of the world, we've kind of developed a mechanism for looking at global population mobility so we can anticipate how outbreaks can spread. The challenge really comes about anticipating disruption because, as I mentioned in my presentation, COVID is spread from person to person through the respiratory route. Zika is spread when humans transport the virus and infect the mosquito, and if that mosquito lives long enough, it can then infect another person, and so forth. So there are many unique aspects to these different microbes. Infectious diseases, maybe it sounds like this is one homogeneous thing, but of course it's a very heterogeneous group of microbes. I guess what I would say is, just maybe picking up on one of the earlier comments, is that this is where we really see the need for human intelligence, and that machine intelligence can be augmenting human intelligence. When we are dealing with a new microbe that humanity has never seen before, we don't have a whole lot of data to actually develop machine learning algorithms. We have to actually resort to an understanding of biology and ecology of these microbes, and taking subject matter expertise and using human intelligence to complement the tools we have with things like machine learning. So I just thought I would kind of leave on that particular note. This is how we've really built our organization. Veterinarians working alongside geographers and physicians and communications experts and so forth, and data scientists. And it's that complementary set of skills that are really critical in tackling some of these types of problems with newly emerging diseases that humanity has never seen before or encountered before. So I'll stop there and turn it back over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Khan. I really wish this pandemic will be conquered in the near future, but I look forward to your successful story in the near time too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Chang, leading the discussion. And also, I'd like to thank all our speakers for sharing all these great insights with us. Finally, we are almost coming to the end. As we know, digital innovations in this time of pandemic crisis are helping us to maintain our everyday life, keeping us safe, and also creating all the apps that keep us safe, and also accelerating drug discovery and helping vaccine development, therapeutics. So I guess there are so many issues and topics we can discuss forever as to the potentials of digital technologies for especially this increasingly non-contact society. But we have to wrap up this session. So again, thank you everyone, especially those watching from everywhere online, for the privilege of your time. And also, we just hope that everyone just takes care of yourself and also each other. Thank you very much.